Halo 2's campaign is somewhat unusual in that a number of missions featured in it come in pairs. There's the intense firefights of Outskirts and Metropolis, the introduction to the Arbiter across the Arbiter and The Oracle, the flood-based mayhem of Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone, and of course there's the hunt for the Prophet of Regret, which takes place on Installation 05 across the missions Delta Halo and Regret. In my last video covering Delta Halo, I took a look at the first part of this dynamic duo, which you can watch by clicking the card on screen now, and this time it's Regret's turn. Delta Halo I believe to be perhaps the finest mission in the entirety of Halo 2, which means Regret has some pretty big shoes to fill. The big question is then, I suppose, does it manage to match its predecessor? Regret gives you a fairly familiar objective to get things started: stop the Covenant activating Halo.
Wait, go back. That's what I thought he said. The Prophet of Regret is planning to activate Halo.
Are you sure?
I shall light this holy ring, release its cleansing flame, and burn a path into the divine beyond.
Pretty much.
With Master Chief's short-term goal being to take out the Prophet of Regret once and for all. After taking out a few pesky drones and an elite or two in the same room Delta Halo concluded in, you'll quickly find yourself outside fighting your way through several sets of Forerunner ruins. There are two things I want to talk about here. Firstly, there's a personalised message you can find by grenade jumping over to an otherwise inaccessible area and zooming in on the right spot. I'm a big fan of the content of this message, as you may well imagine, although I can't help but think adding the words plays and games to the end of it would have really made this particular Easter egg sing. On a more serious note, I also want to quickly touch on the Jackal snipers here, as while they're no bother when you're playing on normal difficulty like I am in the footage you're watching, on higher difficulties they're an absolute nightmare. I tend to only talk about the missions I'm covering on what could be described as the standard difficulty level, but it absolutely must be acknowledged how bad they are both here at the beginning of Regret and throughout the rest of the mission. If you're made of sterner stuff than I am, which isn't too unlikely, then you might well enjoy being destroyed with pinpoint accuracy over and over again until you make it through. But for those of you like myself with a little less patience, this mission could be the one to tip you over the edge, if Jackal Alley earlier in Halo 2's campaign hadn't already. Sharpshooting jackals or not, you'll eventually make it round to the end of the area where you take on a pair of hunters, after which Miranda Keyes sends in some support.
Cortana, the Covenant's getting nosy. I don't want to give away my position, so I'm rerouting a few stragglers back to you. I apologize. These Pelicans are all the support you're gonna get.
Understood, ma'am.
At which point, it's Gondola time. Now, Halo 2 is a game that, for me, has way too many sections set on slow-moving platforms. You can find them during missions, at the end of missions, basically everywhere, and they're a real bugbear of mine when looking at the game's campaign as a whole. Regret's slow-moving platforms, however, are by far the best of the bunch. You're almost always given the opportunity to choose your weapons before each of the sections, and the environment in which they are located is much more visually appealing than, say, those often featured in the Arbiter's campaign, mostly inside grey, relatively uninteresting Forerunner facilities. The Sentinel Wall can be seen cutting through the landscape in the background, the lake itself is quite the spectacle, and you finally get a better sense of Installation 05's scale after Delta Halo, which took place mainly outdoors but could often feel surprisingly narrow even so. The music can definitely sometimes feel a little out of place during these sequences, such as during this first trip when the fast-paced track Leonidas sits somewhat at odds with the pace of the sequence as a whole. You're moving very slowly, sometimes with no enemies in sight, and yet the soundtrack continues to belt out action-orientated music, which creates a strange contrast between what you're seeing and what you're hearing.
We win that one because I can't tell.
Hopping off the gondola into a more stationary area, you clear out another room teeming with Covenant before it's time to take a very different form of transportation.
Ah, now I see. There's a submerged section that connects these towers to the outlying structures. Looks like we're going down. Unless you'd prefer to swim.
And here, Bungie really begins to lay on the exposition, which is one of this mission's real strengths.
I've intercepted a secure transmission from Regret's carrier to something called High Charity. It seems to be a formal apology to the prophets of truth and mercy. Apparently, Regret jumped the gun when he attacked Earth. He's asking the other prophets to forgive his premature arrival, arguing that no human presence was foretold. That explains why there were so few ships in his fleet. But it's odd a prophet would have such bad intel about his enemy's homeworld.
Delta Halo was quite devoid of story much of the time, but Regret is packed full of it. You hear Cortana's musings on the structures themselves as you explore, you learn more about the relationships between the prophets, and later even have the opportunity to listen to Regret himself wax lyrical about the Covenant's plans. Given the mission isn't perhaps the most exciting from a gameplay perspective, especially when compared to the rather eclectic mix of encounters featured in Delta Halo, the way the plot unfolds at pace during Regret makes it a level that still has something to offer, even if there's little new introduced beyond the gondolas, if you classify them as something new and not just another set of floating platforms, of course. Deep beneath the lake, you traverse some frankly gorgeous areas, flanked by enormous windows giving you a view of what's outside, and reach the area's big combat encounter. It's a really entertaining battle which takes place in an area which follows all the rules a first-person shooter arena should. You have 3 lanes, one to the left, one running down the middle, and one to the right, with a decent amount of verticality mixed in, and plenty of options for transitioning between each. It is absolutely the kind of level design that has been used for many years in single and multiplayer shooters, and it really goes to show that you don't need to reinvent the wheel if your game's core mechanics are perfectly tuned, and Halo 2's core mechanics are near perfectly tuned. Listening to the aforementioned sermon from Regret, it's at this point you really begin to build a much clearer picture of what he's all about.
But some, like the humans, chose to impede our progress, block our access to sacred sites, damage holy relics. For their transgressions, the humans shall be hunted until none remain alive.
And that's great, as building a connection between yourself and your target prior to the final confrontation really helps add narrative weight to the entire scenario. If Regret had only been shown in the occasional cutscene with little backstory shared, it wouldn't feel as satisfying to finally take him down. But because Bungie goes that little extra mile to share more background behind the Prophet, his mistakes and his motivations, by the end of the mission you really feel like you've struck a decisive blow to your enemy, even if by the sounds of things, he was on his way out anyway. I mentioned that the large area we just worked our way through is my favourite, but this final hallway definitely finishes a close second. You might not spot any Covenant at first, but look a little closer and you'll realise there are quite a few of them cloaked, lying in wait. The enemy's invisibility effect combines beautifully with the water to create a really striking visual effect, and it's one that always catches me by surprise every time I play through the level. Heading back into the water, so to speak, the exposition continues.
Listen to this. Your haste has jeopardized the fulfillment of our covenant, threatened our grand design. That you shall be spared a public display of our contempt is thanks only to Mercy and his wise counsel. Truth, Mercy, Regret. 3 prophet hierarchs. Killing Regret should shake up the covenant leadership, but frankly, it sounds like you might be doing Truth a favor.
Which is followed by a battle through nearby ruins as both human and Covenant ships arrive to ferry in reinforcements. It's not an overly difficult encounter, and hopefully by its conclusion you'll still have plenty of weapons lying around for the taking as you prepare for your second and final gondola ride. As Banshees swoop in from above and elites equipped with jetpacks attack from an adjacent platform, it's easy to forget that this sequence is none too dissimilar from that earlier in the mission. Bungie increases the difficulty here by just the right amount so as to keep things interesting, and you're rewarded for reaching the end of this crescendo of sorts with a pretty cool little cutscene.
That's the largest Covenant fleet I've ever seen. The largest anyone's ever seen. Get inside the temple and kill Regret before it can stop us.
And you're also able to catch a glimpse of the already mentioned High Charity in the skies directly above you, a very impressive sight indeed. It's unfortunate then that the battles leading up to Regret are more exciting than the battle with Regret himself. The Honour Guards are great fun to go toe to toe with, especially in situations such as this one where they're flanked by plenty of other aggressors, but Regret himself poses little challenge. Granted, he does have weapons, and if you're not really paying attention he might just manage to nobble you, but all you really need to do is move around the edge of the area, hop down to where he's located and serve him up a knuckle sandwich or two, and your work is done. I do however however, like how feeble regret is. Throughout Halo 2, the Prophets are depicted as the driving force behind everything the Covenant does, and yet when it all comes down to it, they're actually rather pathetic. The Covenant is a mighty force, capable of pushing humanity to the brink of extinction. However, its figureheads are anything but. It's a dichotomy by no means exclusive to this fictional alien race. In fact, it's one present just as much in human history, and it makes the Covenant a far more interesting adversary than I think they would have otherwise been. Once Regret is dead as a dodo, the mission promptly comes to an end as Master Chief narrowly escapes being blown into tiny cyborg pieces before something drags him deeper down into the lake. It's a cliffhanger that in my view marks the end of the first half of Halo 2, and I have to say, the image of the Gravemind wrapping its tentacles around Chief is a pretty fantastic way to mark the occasion.
This is not your grave, but you are welcome in it.
As always, we can't forget to talk about the Anniversary Edition either, and this is another mission that really hits the mark. Of particular note are the vistas of Installation 05, especially during the gondola rides, which look amazing, but the real star of the show here is the underwater sections. Frankly, they look magnificent. The elevator rides of sorts are packed full of so much more detail, and the long hallways glistening with the reflections of the water outside are a stunning sight to behold. Even Giant Regret looks pretty blooming sleek. It's wonderful work, and it might also be my favourite section in the entire Anniversary Edition in terms of sheer eye candy. I'll be totally honest with you, I've never been much of a fan of Regret, but playing it a few times for this video made me change my mind. While it definitely doesn't set the world alight from a gameplay perspective, its story is top notch, and really carries a mission which I would otherwise describe as decent but not top tier. Along with Delta Halo, it's another one of those strange pairings which really could and perhaps should have been condensed into a single mission, with Delta Halo bringing the action and Regret picking up the narrative slack, but for whatever reason Bungie decided to make each their own level despite them both being directly connected to one another. Regret may not shine like some of the best missions Halo has to offer, but what it does do very effectively is set up the second half of Halo 2, and in the end, you've got to give it a bit of credit for doing that so well. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you like what you saw, do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.